Good afternoon, class. This is me, Taylor Workman, again, here to talk to you about the Bamyan province of Afghanistan. A little bit more background about me and why I chose this topic is you might not know by looking at me, but I actually was in the Air Force for 7 years. While I was in the Air Force, I learned Pashto, one of the two native languages spoken throughout Afghanistan, the other one being Dari, a variant of Farsi, shared with Iran. Pashto is a tribal language and it has many, many different dialects. My job as a linguist involved many different tasks beyond just learning the language and the culture, but during my time in the Air Force, I learned a lot about Afghanistan and her culture, as well as the different tribal cultures and how they interact with a more shared national Afghan identity. Or more accurately, you might say how they don't interact. That is to say, many people in Afghanistan see themselves as Hazara or Pashtun or what have you, Uzbek. Many of these different tribes and national origins and ethnicities all kind of mix together in a melting pot to create what we know as Afghanistan. Um, why I specifically chose Bamyan today is because Bamyan is a very special place. It is very centralized in Afghanistan. It's in the northeast, um, and many different tribes and cultures have settled there. It's a very, very arable land by Afghan standards, as you'll see in this presentation. So because of that, Bamyan has a lot going on for it. And it tends to be something that's a little different than what most people are expecting when they learn or hear about a place like Afghanistan, which can be kind of seen as a deserty, dust bowl type of country, but it really is not. It's about the size of Texas, so there's many different types of biomes and such in Afghanistan. Not to mention in Bamyan itself, a very rich and diverse backdrop of culture from different empires rising and falling, and almost all of it having a little bit of piece of it in Bamyan. So I did deploy to Afghanistan once, and I have visited Bamyan myself. Obviously, not a very good idea right now, but hopefully someday, all of you, if you want to, will get a chance to visit Afghanistan too. Because believe it or not, it was once one of the safest places in Central Asia and a really, really beautiful place. So yeah, let's move on. So Bamyan, like I said, is in the central part of Afghanistan. It's about 600 miles from China, about 700 miles from Turkmenistan, and about 1,000 miles from Pakistan to the south. The result of this, even though there are mountains on many different sides, is that we get how to put it, a very mixed type of culture where um, different sorts of things are layered on top of each other. Sort of how if you go to Chinatown in San Francisco, it's not China and it's not quite America and it's not quite San Francisco, but it's all of those things at the same time. Bamyan is sort of like this, where it has Chinese influences and Tajikistan influences, Turkmenistan influences, Pakistani influences, and then of course their own Afghan influences. Not to mention more smaller local cultural ones. Bamyan is a very beautiful place. It's very green, has mountains all around it. It's basically a valley, and this has sort of protected it from a lot of the bigger battles in history that have taken place in Afghanistan, be it more recently with the American invasion of Afghanistan, or if you even want to go further back, all the way to Genghis Khan's invasion of all of Asia. In Bamyan, the Taliban were the legitimate government of Afghanistan starting in about the early 90s when they overthrew the secular Northern Alliance-backed government that took over when Afghanistan defeated the Soviets. The Taliban sort of had there's this misconception about the Taliban that they were trained and armed by Americans, which isn't exactly true. The Taliban are a loosely organized set of religious fundamentalists, Islamist fundamentalists that come from very many different cultures and are trained by many different places. However, most of the people that America backed when the Soviets invaded in the late 80s and early 90s were part of the Northern Alliance. The Northern Alliance was a secular group of mostly Tajiks and Turkmens and Hazaras, not Pashtuns, which the Taliban is majorly, who then established a mostly democratic government that was dealing with a Taliban-based insurgency for a very long time. Eventually, the Taliban did take over in the 90s and were in charge until the American invasion in 2001, when they refused to hand over Osama bin Laden upon their request. Taliban is a word that means students, and of course, in this particular context, they use it to mean religious students. Um, it is not a traditional terrorist cell, right? The Taliban generally does not have expeditionary uh, goals. They don't desire to see America fall, and they generally don't want to do anything outside of their own country for the most part. For the most part, their desire is just to see an extremely closed off Wahhabist style Afghanistan. They also allied with the with the Northern Alliance out of convenience when the Soviets invaded. However, they mostly have nothing in common as far as what they want for the future of Afghanistan. So Bamyan has Pashtuns, Hazaras, Tajiks, Turkmens. As I said, all these things together resulted in a sort of tough situation because the Taliban didn't really have much of a foothold there until they took over the country. But once that happened, they descended upon Bamyan because in Bamyan there are these extremely interesting and beautiful Buddha statues carved into the sheer rock face of the nearby mountains. Of course, Buddha is an idol, which is expressly forbidden in Islam, especially an idol of another religion, which the Taliban, again, are Islamist fundamentalists. And so idolatry and worshipping of a god other than Muhammad is something seen as very bad for them. So generally, and before they rose to power, they told everyone that they would not be harming these World Heritage sites established by UNESCO. But of course, uh, cooler heads did not prevail, and these 500-foot tall statues carved into the sheer cliff face, as you can see in the image, were destroyed, were demolished by the Taliban in the late 90s. However, there are attempts to protect the caves now. Of course, the actual carvings are no longer there, but for the most part, the memory and the history of these places lives on to this day. And hopefully one day we will all be able to visit and see them. Um, Afghanistan's been called the graveyard of empires before. Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, America, the Soviets, many different countries have attempted to take over and unify Afghanistan under a single banner. And the Taliban too, and frankly, this seems to be a nearly impossible task. Almost all of these groups have failed. But one thing that's great about Bamyan is that its relative isolation and safety has resulted in a sort of tapestry leading across time of all these different historical moments in Afghan history. And because of that, I think it's a really interesting place. And I hope you learned something about it today. And I hope one day you get to visit if you are so inclined. Thanks. Have a good one.